This video is a complete comparison between the Garmin Instinct 3 and the Garmin Fenix 8. Both myself and my wife have been putting these watches through their paces side by side, with the Instinct 3 on one side and the Fenix 8 on the other side, across a wide number of sports, from cycling to running to open water swimming to hiking, you name it, to see how well they compare in terms of not just features but performance, as well as of course the hardware. In this video I'm going to dive through a bunch of those different topics, including again the hardware, the software, the features, what things are totally different, what things are the same. After all, the Fenix 8 is twice the price of the Instinct 3, yet in reality it has somewhere between 70 and 90 more core features than the Instinct 3. The question is, are those core features things you actually care about? Oh, and then stay around towards the end of the video where I'm going to talk about one of the Garmin watch options that you have that has all the features of the Fenix but the price of the Instinct 3. It's kind of a bit of a sleeper of a watch. So more on that a little bit later on. Okay, so starting off with the models, the very first thing to understand is there's two different display types offered in both of these product lines. There's an AMOLED display and there's a MIP-based display. An AMOLED display is what you'd imagine a much more colorful, vibrant, kind of brilliant display, versus a MIP-based display in the case of the Instinct is a black and white display. In the case of the Fenix 8 is a color display, but without all that vibrancy. However, the MIP-based display generally has a much longer battery life. In the case of the Instinct, for example, it has an unlimited battery life depending on what modes you use it in. That said, for myself, I generally prefer the AMOLED display just because of the brilliance of the display and being able to see it in darker and kind of low light conditions, and the battery life isn't really a problem for me, as we'll get into in just a second. Once you've decided on the display type, then we get into the sizing. In the case of the Fenix series, there are three different sizes: a 43, a 47, and a 51mm size. And in the case of the Instinct series, there are two core sizes, a 45 and a 50mm size. There is also a 40mm size, but that is for the Fenix E. And the Fenix E is very much not a Fenix 3 or even a Fenix 2. It's like a Fenix 1.5, separate video on that down the road here. And then of course within the Fenix lineup there's also like sapphire and titanium options and things like that. But point is, the core pricing is as you see it on the screen right there. And hey, just a quick note, if you are finding this video interesting and useful, just watch it all the way through. That's the main thing I'm asking for you to do here, is watch the whole thing. That's all the YouTube gods really care about. So let's dig into those hardware differences, starting off on the outside and kind of working our way in. From a case standpoint, the Fenix 8 has nicer case materials. It's got different metal options, including stainless steel and titanium, versus the case on the Instinct is essentially a plastic case, though it does have this like metal band that goes around the outside to somehow increase durability or something like that. I don't mind the touch, it's a nice touch there. And then on the underside of the case of the Fenix 8 has a metal backing, versus the Instinct has again that kind of plastic shell there. Flipping it back over though, we have the display sizes. In the case of the Fenix, they have larger display sizes. Meanwhile, back on the Instinct, there's actually two different display sizes depending on which display type you're using. In the case of AMOLED, there's a 1.2 and a 1.3 inch display. And in the case of Solar, there's a 0.9 inch and a 1.1 inch display. Note again, on the Instinct Solar Editions, those displays are black and white, versus on the Fenix Solar Editions, those displays are color. Next, the Fenix 8 has a touchscreen display, the Instinct 3 does not. That's probably one of the biggest surprises, actually, the Instinct 3, especially in the AMOLED side, there is no touchscreen display. Next, one of the big features rolled out to the Fenix 8 was the addition of a speaker and a microphone. Now, the Instinct does have a beeper, but not a speaker. So the speaker can play music and voice and things like that, which we'll get into some of those software features later on, whereas the Instinct just has that beeper for tones and navigation and whatnot, but not an actual speaker. Likewise, the Fenix 8 has Wi-Fi, which is used for syncing music as well as downloading stuff. The Instinct 3 has no Wi-Fi. The Fenix 8 also has offline storage for music. Again, the Instinct does not have offline storage for music. Next, another biggie is the optical heart rate sensor on the back of the watch. The Fenix 8, along with the predecessor, the Fenix 7 Pro and the Epix Pro series, has Garmin's Elevate V5 optical heart rate sensor in it, versus the Instinct 3 has Garmin's Gen 4 optical heart rate sensor. The core thing that you care about there, though, is the fact that the Gen 5 sensor has ECG capabilities as well as wrist temperature, and is generally just more accurate. In fact, if we look at the accuracy right now between a couple different workouts I did using these two watches side by side, the Instinct 3 on one wrist and the Fenix 8 on the other wrist, in many cases the accuracy is identical. However, in harder conditions, for example, last night I went out for an interval run in kind of cooler temperatures, and the Instinct 3 really struggled with that Gen 4 sensor there, especially again for high intensity intervals on a cooler night. That's something that optical heart rate sensors tend to struggle, yet the Gen 5 unit had no problems at all there. Again, I dive into the accuracy of all these sensors in my reviews, but just at a high level, you're getting more accuracy out of that Gen 5 sensor. Next, the Fenix 8 has a depth gauge in it. That depth gauge is used for diving activities, activities, both scuba diving as well as free diving. That goes down to 40 meters in depth in terms of what it'll measure. Both watches have the same 100-meter water resistance rating, but in terms of the depth gauge there, that only exists in the Fenix 8. Likewise, with that depth gauge, the Fenix 8 also added so-called inductive buttons, basically meaning they are theoretically leak-proof because there's no O-ring in the button itself. It's all done with induction behind the scenes, versus the Instinct uses kind of an old school, if you will, regular button design, where you press it, there's an O-ring inside, and there's a potential chance for leak. But I wouldn't overthink that. It's something that, again, every other watch in the market uses regular buttons like that, as opposed to leak-proof design. That's just not really a core issue. And the last hardware difference comes down to weight. The Instinct 3 weighs less than the Fenix 8, likely due to that plastic body as opposed to the various metals in there. And in fact, when you're comparing the units, while they have obviously the millimeter sizes there of 43, 47, and 51, I find that comparing the 48 millimeter Fenix 8 to the 50 millimeter Instinct 3 feels the most similar because of the weight. When I go up to the 51 millimeter Fenix, it feels like a much bigger watch, mostly because of that weight, versus the 50 millimeter Instinct 3 feels, again, much more like a medium-sized watch as opposed to as big, primarily due to the weight, not the actual size of the case itself. Now, there are a bunch of hardware features that are the same. I won't read off the list. They are all right there. The core thing you need to know is they do both have that same waterproof rating. They do both have Garmin Pay, and everything else is essentially the same from a hardware standpoint in terms of those core hardware features. Obviously, the solar panel differs between the watch in terms of the addressable solar area, with the Instinct having more effectively addressable solar area than the Fenix 8 does, which you'll see in the battery life side of stuff. In fact, now is a good time to talk about that battery life, and Garmin has a slew of different ways they give battery life specs depending on different modes. In my mind, I would really focus on like 3 core modes, probably really just 2 core modes. Number 1, smartwatch mode, primarily an always-on display mode if you're using an AMOLED display. And number 2, your SatIQ GPS time. In the case of the Instinct 3, the option for all systems plus multi-band is including SatIQ enabled by default. In the case of the Fenix 8, they've broken out into a separate line item. Again, there's a lot of numbers there, but as a general rule of thumb, roughly speaking, the Garmin Instinct 50mm editions are pretty similar to the Garmin Fenix 8 47mm editions from a battery standpoint on both solar and AMOLED, until we get to the GPS only mode. In that third mode, the GPS only mode, is where we start to see some of the major differences of the Instinct from a battery standpoint, potentially going out in the solar edition to the forever or unlimited power, because it pulls much less battery in exchange for slightly less accurate tracks. And then when it comes to smartwatch life on all these models in my testing, they have been hitting their claims, both in the Instinct side as well as the Fenix side. They're pretty much hitting all of Garmin's claims there. So next up, we've got the software feature differences. And the things to understand about a Garmin Fenix series watch is that you're talking roughly about 1,000 features on a Garmin Fenix series watch. And I don't mean that like kiddingly, like legitimately, there are probably about 1,000 features all in on these watches, especially when you consider all the settings and things like that. Even in this list I'm about to show you, we're talking 50 to 60 core features that are basically umbrellas for dozens of features underneath each one of them. Now, the biggest feature difference that you're going to see right away is the lack of mapping on the Instinct 3. The Instinct 3 does not have any offline maps. It does have navigation. You can do so-called breadcrumb style navigation where you follow a little line, but there's no contour maps or maps that show you mountains or trails or lakes or anything like that, nor can you do offline routing where you say, you know what, I want to go to this point over here and I want to follow a trail there. In the case of the Instinct, if you tell you want to go to some point, it's just going to go straight as the crow flies. Now, the Instinct, to its credit, a very tiny amount of credit, did add a city listing map to the Instinct 3 AMOLED edition. And what this will show you is a city on the map as a dot, like you see right there. The problem is this is only showing big cities, and they're like 50K away, when there are tons of towns and stuff that are just a kilometer or 2 away. So if I was lost in the mountains and decided to navigate to Palma because that was the only one on the map, I would have passed a gazillion other cities that were maybe just 1 or 2 kilometers away and try to get 50K away, which just would have been silly. And of course, within that mapping category is all the mapping derivatives like round-trip routing and ski maps and all that kind of stuff. None of that is there as well. Just simply just a blank screen. Now, moving away from mapping, the next software feature that's missing is ECG. I talked about in the hardware standpoint, but within ECG is AFib detection. That is not there. And then we get to a whole slate of sort of endurance-focused features, things like no endurance score, no hill score, no climb pro. No climb pro is probably the biggest disappointment for me from a software feature standpoint. I love climb pro in the mountains. It's my favorite Garmin Garmin feature when I'm hiking because it automatically tells me how long the next climb is, how much ascent I have remaining, the steepness, the grade, etc. based on my route, and it just does that automatically, and that does not exist on the Instinct 3. After that, there's no cycling ability feature, there's no stamina feature, there's no jet lag advisor. Of course, there's no scuba or diving features like I mentioned earlier on, so nothing in that range. There is the snorkel mode, but it will not capture your depth as you go down. There is no voice features, including no voice assistance, no voice commands, no voice notes, and no calling on the Instinct 3. You can accept or reject a call from the Instinct 3, but it's just simply doing it on behalf of your phone. When it comes to widgets, there's a bunch of interesting little widgets that aren't there. For example, there's no countdown widget, there's no dog track widget, there's no fish forecast widget, there's no recovery widget on the Instinct 3, no stock widgets, and no focus modes. I wouldn't worry too much about focus modes. It's something that Garmin introduced on the Fenix 8, but hasn't really completed that. As you imagine, kind of like focus modes like you see in your phone, but that concept isn't really flushed out yet on the Fenix 8. And then lastly, there's no new Fenix 8 UI on the Instinct 3, which might sound like an obvious thing, but when Garmin talked about introducing this new Fenix UI back in August, the assumption was that was going to be the new UI for most products going forward, and that hasn't happened. I don't consider that a loss, to be honest. I'm not a big fan of the new UI, so I'm pretty happy with the UI on the Instinct 3. Okay, next up, we have all the sport profiles on these watches, and surprisingly, they are relatively similar. In fact, almost identical. Here's the huge list of all the sport profiles on the Garmin Instinct 3, and then down the bottom there, I've just added the Fenix 8 ones in bold. As you can see, just a handful of other ones, and some of them make sense. For example, scuba diving and free diving, sailing and sailing expedition. There's also adventure racing, ultra run, and mountaineering. However, there is jump rope. I'm unclear on why the Instinct doesn't have jump rope. I don't know what jump rope did to not be included on the Instinct 3, but no jump rope for you. And in fact, the story is much the same when we look at sensor support. The Instinct 3 has the vast majority of the ANT+ and Bluetooth sensors supported on it as a Fenix 8, except for the ones, again, listed at the bottom there in bold. But otherwise, both those units support everything else pretty much the same. Speaking of things that are the same, there is a giant list of things that are the same here. I'm just going to let it scroll on through, but by and large, when it comes to all the under the cover stuff like activity tracking and sleep tracking, HRV tracking, all of the health and fitness metrics there from a general standpoint, those are all treated exactly the same between them. Likewise, they also have a lot of the newer features like Garmin Share, which allows you to share basically files and stuff like that, course files, for example, wirelessly between two watches. So that's useful if you're a trailhead and your friend doesn't have the route file for your hike that day. You can just simply basically wirelessly send it between these two watches, even outside of cellular coverage on your app. And again, that's just a huge list of things that I just want to mention that they're all identical or effectively identical from implementation standpoint. So if you want all those things, you're good to go. And in fact, one of those things that is identical is the GPS accuracy on both these two units. As I mentioned earlier on, the heart rate accuracy does vary quite a bit, but from a GPS standpoint, both these units have multi-band or dual frequency chipsets in them, and both of them have SAT-IQ. And in my testing, these are performing identically across a wide number of different scenarios and continue to be industry leading when it comes to GPS accuracy. Okay, so let's wrap things up here and talk about what I would say are deal breakers for me personally. These may not be for you, but this is the things that drive me to the Fenix 8 or even a Fenix 7 Pro or Epix Pro series, because they're identical in that sense. And there's three core things. Number one is mapping. Mapping for me is super important. I'm going out on a 50K hike tomorrow, and with that, I want maps, and if I need to change my route, I want those maps on my watch. That's just the way I am. And then that gets to the second feature, which is Climb Pro. That's a feature which, as I said before, I find incredibly valuable in the mountains when I'm doing lots of big climbs that could take an hour, 2 hours for a given climb, or even half a day for a climb. To be able to know exactly where I am on that climb is incredibly valuable. And rounding out that top three is the Gen 4 optical heart rate sensor on the Instinct 5 compared to the Gen 5 on the Fenix 8. I find that generally speaking, the Gen 4 is fine for most scenarios, but when you get to harder scenarios, for example, outdoor cycling, cooler nights, running intervals, things like that, that's where the Gen 5 sensor definitely shines. Ultimately though, one of the things to keep in mind is you don't have to go out and buy a Fenix 8 to get all these features. As I mentioned at the very beginning, the Garmin Epix Gen 2 has been floating at roughly $399, so less than the Instinct 3, which is simply a Garmin Fenix before they changed the name from Epix to Fenix. It is an AMOLED display. It has all the features I mentioned, virtually everything in this entire list it has, except for the Gen 5 sensor. But otherwise, it has all the mapping, it has all the depth you expect from a Garmin Fenix watch. That'd be my general recommendation for not just the best option in this category, but frankly, one of the best smartwatch deals out there on the market today. Hopefully you found this video interesting or useful. If so, go ahead and give it a like or subscribe for plenty more sports technology goodness. With that, have a good one.